Endurance is a defensive mechanic in Last Epoch that I sometimes see people misunderstand, so I'm making a short video to open up a discussion about it. Keep in mind that this video is being recorded during patch 1.0, during Last Epoch's first ever cycle following its release. If you're from the future, a lot of the information may be outdated. Endurance is a defensive layer that all Last Epoch characters have inherently, where damage dealt to health below a certain threshold is reduced by a percentage. By default, characters take 20% less damage to health below 20% of their max health. The cutoff below which the damage reduction is applied is called your endurance threshold. Endurance mitigates all types of damage and works on both hits and damage over time. You can see your endurance threshold in-game by hovering over your health bar. One common misconception is that you need to be below your endurance threshold when you are hit in order for endurance to reduce that hit's damage. This is not true. If you are above your endurance threshold, and an incoming hit takes you below your endurance threshold, endurance will mitigate only the portion of damage that is dealt below your endurance threshold. For example, let's say that I'm at 300 health, and my endurance threshold is 200. If I take 150 damage, then the first 100 damage is unmitigated by endurance. The last 50 damage is reduced by 20% to 40 for a total of 140 damage taken. Another thing to note is that endurance does not work well with ward. Endurance only reduces damage dealt to health, which means you can't play a low-life ward build and constantly benefit from being below your endurance threshold. The damage dealt to your ward will not be mitigated by endurance no matter what your current health is. Without any investment into endurance, it's not a very useful defensive layer. If you have 1000 health, then the bottom 200 health has 20% damage reduction, meaning it takes 250 raw damage to kill you from your endurance threshold. Altogether, your effective HP is 800 plus 250, or 1050. Therefore, for a purely health-based build, endurance by default only gives you 5% more effective HP. There are two ways to make endurance a stronger defensive layer: raising endurance and raising endurance threshold. Raising endurance means raising the percentage by which your endurance reduces damage taken. For example, an affix granting plus 15% endurance would take you from 20% less damage taken to 35% less damage taken. Endurance is capped at 60%, and there is no way to raise this cap. Raising your endurance threshold is primarily done with modifiers like this, which add a flat amount. So if you have 1000 health, then plus 70 endurance threshold would raise your endurance threshold from 200 to 270. There is no cap on endurance threshold, though raising it above your max health would be pointless. So is it worth investing in endurance? If you're a ward-based build, there's no reason to invest anything in endurance. Endurance will never cover a significant enough portion of your total HP to justify investing in it. If you are a health-based build, my opinion is that you should at least invest in getting your endurance to 60%, even if you choose not to raise your endurance threshold above its base value. Beyond that, is it worth investing in raising your endurance threshold? I would say in general yes, but that's a more complicated question to answer. Let me explain my reasoning. Why should you get 60% endurance? Let's do the math. If you have 60% endurance, and you have 0 additional endurance threshold, then the bottom 20% of your health gets 60% damage reduction. With 1000 health, the bottom 200 health becomes an effective 500 health, for a total of 1300 effective health compared to 1050 effective health at 20% endurance. Going from 20% endurance to 60% endurance is therefore roughly 24% more effective HP. Given that doing so requires only 3 non-exalted suffixes on gear, or 1 suffix and an empowered monolith blessing, this is almost certainly worth it. In my opinion, you should prioritize percent endurance suffixes over flat health suffixes until you're at 60% endurance. Okay, so how do I judge the value of endurance threshold modifiers? For example, a tier 5 endurance threshold suffix on gloves provides 56 to 75 endurance threshold. For comparison, a tier 5 flat health suffix on gloves provides 56 to 75 health. Which one of these is better? Let's start with some basic math. 60% damage reduction is a 2.5 times multiplier to effective HP. At 60% endurance, every point of health that's protected by endurance is basically super health that's actually worth 2.5 health. Therefore, plus 1 endurance threshold essentially replaces 1 health with 2.5 health, for a net 1.5 health. Ignoring all other context, you can think of plus 100 endurance threshold as being equivalent to 150 additional health. Furthermore, this plus 100 endurance threshold is actually even better than having 150 extra health, since reducing damage is preferable to simply having more health. I would rather have 1000 health and 50% damage reduction than 2000 health, despite both being the same effective health. This is because it's easier to recover 1000 health than it is to recover 2000 health. By that logic, Endurance Threshold is better than Health point for point because it has better synergy with Healing, Regen, and Leech. Unfortunately, the comparison is not quite that simple. Health has several advantages of its own. The most obvious benefit is that Health actually has multipliers. There's a lot of places you can get increased health on gear and passives. On the other hand, there are no increased endurance threshold modifiers in the game. If you have 50% increased health, which is a pretty reasonable amount for an endgame character to have, then plus 1 health is actually plus 1.5 health, which on its own is already enough to close the gap with endurance threshold in terms of effective HP. But wait, there's more. Because your base endurance threshold is 20% of health, every 1 health is an additional 0.2 endurance threshold. If you have 60% endurance, that 0.2 endurance threshold is effectively 0.3 health. Altogether, with 50% increased health and 60% endurance, a flat plus 100 health modifier comes out to plus 195 effective health. On top of all this, health has the advantage of also being stun avoidance. In Last Epoch, stun chance is based on damage taken versus the sum of your max health and your current ward, so having more health makes you less likely to be stunned. Because endurance makes you take less damage, it can also reduce your chance to be stunned. However, in practice, many incoming hits will occur when you're near max health, not when you're near or below your endurance threshold. Increasing your endurance threshold will likely do nothing to prevent stuns when you're near max health, unless your endurance threshold is extremely high. For that reason, max health modifiers provide more reliable protection against stuns than endurance threshold modifiers. So what's the verdict? Would you rather have a tier 5 endurance threshold suffix or a tier 5 flat health suffix on your gloves? The endurance threshold will usually provide less effective health due to its lack of multipliers. However, the endurance threshold may be more useful when factoring in its synergy with health recovery. Personally, I prefer endurance threshold modifiers to flat health modifiers. I generally have enough defensive layers to slow down incoming damage to the point where I can reliably recover when taking big damage. Having a solid chunk of endurance gives me the confidence to heal through otherwise dangerous encounters. In my personal hierarchy of defensive layers, percent health and hybrid health modifiers are definitely higher priorities than either endurance or endurance threshold, but I like endurance threshold more than flat health. One other thing to note is that for some reason, tier 6 and tier 7 endurance threshold modifiers are significantly stronger than tier 6 and tier 7 flat health modifiers. Generally speaking, tier 6 modifiers are about 50% stronger than tier 5, and tier 7 modifiers are about 100% stronger. Health seems to follow this pattern, but endurance threshold doesn't. Tier 6 endurance threshold is about 80% stronger than tier 5, and tier 7 is about 150% stronger than tier 5. Why that is, I don't know. The consequence of this is that exalted endurance threshold is actually a pretty valuable stat, especially on slots that can't roll percent or hybrid health, such as rings and relics. That's all I'm going to say for this video. I was going to talk a bit about Death Seal, the Lich skill that has extraordinary synergy with endurance, but I'll try to stay on topic. This is my first video on Last Epoch mechanics, as everything on my channel prior to this point has been about Path of Exile. For those of you playing Last Epoch, please let me know if you have any feedback on this video or just mechanical questions I can answer in the comments. For those of you who are primarily interested in my Path of Exile content, don't worry, I still plan to play PoE leagues and stuff. I didn't play much of Affliction League, only getting one character to maps before getting preoccupied with other games like TFT. I'll probably be playing a lot of both PoE and Last Epoch for the foreseeable future, so expect some of both on this channel. Thanks for watching.